Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Civic Signal. Today, we will be discussing why voters who value democracy participate in democratic backsliding, a study by Dr. Aaliyah Braley, Gabriel S. Lentz, Deval Ajota, Hussein Ranama, and Alex Pentland, all professors at UC Berkeley and MIT.
So, like the title suggests, this paper is about what's called democratic backsliding. And essentially, what democratic backsliding is when countries that have democratic systems of government move in the direction of becoming less democratic by concentrating power, adhering to rights less, or having traditions that are democratic go away.
Now, these authors are not the first researchers to look at this question about democracy and democratic backsliding. And they kind of jump into this conversation where there's been a lot of research already that shows that Americans generally and very strongly and throughout a long period of time support and believe in democracy. They think it's a good thing. We as Americans value democracy, and really democracy meaning my voice matters, your voice matters, and we have the ability to participate even when that leads to outcomes that I may not agree with or that you may not agree with. The research has also shown pretty consistently that Americans are much more willing to accept anti-democratic behaviors and rhetoric from leaders of their own political party or ideological leaders that they agree with ideologically. And equally, people condemn very consistently and very strongly anti-democratic behavior and rhetoric from leaders on the other side of the political aisle.
So the authors see a question here where there's a discontinuity between how much Americans value democracy, but then also their acceptance of their own leaders doing anti-democratic things. So they present a theory to try to answer this question that they'll later test. And this theory is called the subversion dilemma. So they think that this behavior is driven by the belief that the opponents will undermine democracy first. Citizens who want to live in a democracy may come to tolerate defection by their representatives to save democracy from their opponents. So basically, in a step-by-step process, this theory is first would-be authoritarian leaders convince their supporters that the other side is subverting democracy. So then that leads the voters to tolerate backsliding by their leaders. And then that prompts the other side to have legitimate fears by the party that is backsliding. And so then they will tolerate drastic action by their own side to combat it. And you can see that this creates a spiral in the country. The democracy of the country heads to the dumps.
The first study that the authors ran was they asked 1,973 US participants a series of questions. They asked them 7 questions and asked them to respond with their willingness personally to self-identify of how willing they are to break certain democratic norms. And then they asked them these questions and asked them to respond with how willing they think that the opposing partisans or members of the other party would be to break these norms. And just an example, some of the questions that they asked are: would you support banning far right or left rallies at the state capitol, ignoring controversial rulings by judges appointed by the other party, reducing the number of voting stations in towns that support the other political party? So some of these are pretty extreme, right? That would be very clearly unconstitutional, illegal, and also in a society that values democracy, that these would be things that would be largely condemned as anti-democratic.
So after they asked the respondents these 7 questions, they took the average score of each of the questions and scaled the averages between 0 and 1. And the results here are shown on this graph. So here on the x-axis is a scale from 0 to 1, willingness to subvert democracy. And then on the y-axis is the density, and that's just the number of respondents that fall at that point. So any bump on the graph is where most of the people fell on the graph. So as you can see, this top graph is for the Democrats. The Democrats self-reported themselves as not willing to break democratic norms. So the average score for Democrats was 0.28, so that's really low. However, the Republicans perceived the Democrats on average at a 0.67, and so that's like a 40-point difference. And then for the Republicans, we see a really similar story. The Republicans self-reported their willingness to subvert democracy as a 0.24, whereas Democrats perceived it as a 0.65. So it's about the same for both parties. They will admit that they don't want to subvert democracy, but they really strongly think the other side is going to.
On the x-axis of these charts, we see the perceived willingness of opposing partisans to subvert democratic norms. And then on the left, we have the willingness, self-reported for themselves, to subvert democracy. And what we see here is that the respondents who think that the other party is the most likely to subvert democracy were the ones who they themselves reported that they were also the most willing to subvert democracy. And individuals who had very low levels of thinking that the other party would subvert democracy tended, on average, to report very low levels of willingness to subvert democracy themselves. There's this correlation here between fear of the other party breaking democratic norms and willingness to do so yourself.
So study one seems to support the researchers' theory. And so they build on this information to see if there really is a causal mechanism between perceiving the other side as willing to subvert democracy and being willing to subvert democracy on your own. And so in study two, they do a very similar thing. They get 2,500 respondents, and they ask them the same 7 questions about the other side. However, half of the respondents receive an intervention or a treatment where, after asking each questions, the researchers reported the results from that question from the previous study to the participants. So they would answer the question and then hear what the other side actually thought, and then they would go into the next question. So as they were filling out the survey, they were receiving feedback basically for how accurate their responses were, and they were gaining knowledge for how strongly the other side does actually support democracy.
So on each of these four graphs, on the x-axis, we have the respondents' perceived willingness of the opposing party to subvert democracy. And so how we got these is they were asked these 7 questions about these democratic norms, and they were asked, how willing do you think members of the other party are to break this democratic norm? And then they again made this a scale of 0 to 1, combining their answers on each of the 7 questions. So on the left side of this graph here, we see the respondents who identify with the Democratic Party, and on the right side, we see those who identify with the Republican Party. What we see here, if you look at the top left, is the respondents who were asked about their perception of Republicans, and they tended to have high levels of reporting that they believed that Republicans were willing to subvert democratic norms. But then if you look at the chart directly below, these are the individuals who received the treatment, who were told the Republicans who responded to this survey reported this level of willingness. And people responded to that. They largely took that and said, okay, the Republicans said that. I think that they think this. And it's the same if you look at the right with the Republicans. On the top, we see those who did not receive the treatment and were just asked their thoughts about the Democrats. And then on the bottom, we see those who were asked their opinion about the Democrats and then told, here's what they actually think. They also move toward the correct levels of accurately identifying that most Democrats are not willing to support Democratic backsliding.
So after the respondents answered the questions about the other side, they again answered the questions about themselves. And so again, here on the left, we have the Democratic respondents, and here on the right, we have the Republican respondents. The x-axis is your own willingness to subvert democracy. So those in the control group had a very similar curve as in study one, where they didn't want to subvert democracy. However, those who received the treatment, their curves are much closer to zero. So even though The control group didn't want to subvert democracy themselves. The treatment group wanted to subvert democracy even less. And so, again, this supports their theory that people are willing to subvert democracy themselves because they're afraid that the other side is going to subvert democracy. Once that fear goes away because they're introduced to information that shows that the other side is not willing to subvert democracy, so does the respondent's own willingness to subvert democracy. It goes away, it goes closer to zero.
As the second part to this study, they followed up with these respondents later, and they gave them a hypothetical primary election between two candidates of their own uh, political party. And one of the candidates um, said that they had supported breaking one of the democratic norms that they had been asked about earlier, one of these seven questions. And the other candidate was opposed to breaking that norm. And the candidate who supported it, specifically, it said that they supported it because that candidate believed that the opposing political party was also doing that. And we see between these two groups, the control group, who is just asked, how much do you think the other party is willing to do this? And the treatment group, who between each question was told, this is the percentage of respondents on the other side who supported it. There was a significant difference. And the difference was that those who had received that treatment were 14% less likely to choose the candidate who supported breaking the democratic norm. And this is, 14% difference is somewhat small, but it's significant enough in terms of elections when things often come down to just a couple of percentages, especially within intra-party contests like a primary election.
So, what the second part of the study shows is that this effect moves beyond just survey questions. There's actually indicators from this mock election that receiving accurate information about the loyalty to democracy of the other side actually translates to behavioral changes. It is like voting in elections that lead people to choose candidates more devoted to democracy rather than those more comfortable breaking democratic norms and traditions. So, after doing the second study, the researchers were just a little bit concerned that asking about the other party's loyalty to democracy and then immediately asking about your own loyalty to democracy, uh, they were concerned that that might trigger a bias in the respondents to say what they think the respondents want to hear. So they ran a third study, which was basically identical to the second study. The only difference between study two and this third study that they did is they asked the respondents the first half of the survey about the other party first, and then a couple days later, they asked about your own devotion to democracy to see if that changed anything. And basically, it didn't. Those in the control group had a coefficient of about 0.32, and those in the treatment group had a coefficient of about 0.24. Again, showing that the treatment of introducing the correct information about the other side to the respondents changed the respondents and made them more loyal to democracy.
Looking at all three of these short studies that the authors ran, there's a very consistent story that's being told, which is namely that partisans or members of a certain political party are willing to break democratic norms largely to the extent that they feel the opposing party supports breaking those democratic norms. The authors also found that you can reduce exaggerated beliefs in the respondents of a certain political party when you show them that the other political party is not really willing to undermine democracy to the extent that most people on that side think that they are. Essentially, that when you show people that the opposing side is not as dangerous as political leaders or the media may make them seem, that people respond to that very positively. And people also saw that this translates to real behavior, such as voting or supporting candidates, whether people think that the opposing party is willing to undermine democracy and subvert those norms or not. It works in both directions.
So, to start off our discussion about these findings, I want to mention that the authors are a little bit doom and gloom about the state of democracy in the world and in America in their paper. And I think one important thing to note about this is that America has really strong institutions that help limit the consolidation of power in the presidency. So even though we've had a series of very charismatic presidents on both sides who have consolidated executive power, institutions like the checks from Congress and the Supreme Court have done a really good job at reining in some of the less democratic things that these presidents have done.
It's also important to note that while the authors primarily focus on rhetoric and decisions coming from political leaders, that this is not only an issue that we see with our politicians and with party leaders. It's not just presidents, it's not just candidates for public office. That this is something that happens a lot in the media because most people don't get their news exclusively straight from the mouth of politicians. That there's a middleman, even when it is a politician speaking. And then on a lot of issues, the politician's not even involved themselves. We're getting it from podcasters, from YouTubers, we're getting it from journalists, from newspapers, from cable TV. And this is where a lot of partisans are saying the other side is willing to subvert democracy. The other side is attacking democratic norms. The other side is willing to do these dangerous and violent things. And therefore, we need to be willing to do them too. A lot of it's coming from media figures. And then with social media, a lot of this is coming from just other people who are not professional media figures, but are putting their voices out into the media. And so it's very important to not have an echo chamber in the media. It's very important to not only listen to what politicians are saying, but to really hear what the other side is actually saying about particular issues, because it is true there are some issues on both sides of the aisle. We can look to recent years. There have been politicians and media figures who are prominent who have proposed and who have supported anti-democratic measures on their side. But it's not to the extent that many politicians and many figures in the media and even normal people, as we see in these survey responses, would think or would have you think.
I think the most concerning thing that comes from this paper is the authors established that support for anti-democratic leaders and policies can stem from perceptions of the other side's loyalty to democracy. However, the perceptions of the other side's loyalty to democracy that we see in the current political landscape are inaccurate. And this drives people towards support for less democratic leaders. And I think that this is kind of ironic because we have self-reported that we love democracy so much, but in the face of threats to democracy, we're willing to run away from democracy instead of trusting that, again, our institutions and the process are strong enough to stand against threats to it. And I think that that's really concerning that self-proclaimed loyalty to democracy doesn't exactly translate to behavioral loyalty to democracy.
There's a quote that I really like from Lawrence Corbridge, who said, "The challenge is not so much closing the gap between our actions and our beliefs. Rather, the challenge is closing the gap between our beliefs and the truth." What we see so much coming from the figures in the media and from our politicians in today's day and age is people say, we need to be strong. We need to fight for the truth. We need to fight for what's right. We need to do these things. And while it is true that we need to support the things that are right and good, if we're coming from a place where we are inaccurately perceiving our fellow Americans as being our enemies and we're seeing them as supporting anti-democratic issues and policies that they really don't, then all of that conflict that we're going to have with each other is over nothing. And just like Brandon was talking about at the beginning, that this is a spiraling issue, that when we perceive them as being anti-democratic, then they are going to more accurately predict us as being more anti-democratic. And then we're going to see their rhetoric and we're going to say, well, see, they're doing these things now. And it just spirals out of control. Where if at the beginning we had just both recognized, we may not agree with every issue, but they're not trying to destroy the country. And they look at us and they say, I don't agree with them on every single policy and I have substantive differences, but they're not trying to take my voice out of America, then we can have a common ground to approach our policy differences. And this is what we need to do, that any discussion relating to policy and the interpersonal conflict that we have when it comes to politics needs to start from the ground of realizing that American democracy is something by and large that people on both sides of the political aisle agree with each other on. This is something that we value. And that when we recognize that, then we are not only more capable of stopping anti democratic actions from the other side, but perhaps even more importantly, where our voices are heard the most, we can stop this from within our own political parties and people who we agree with ideologically otherwise, and we can keep our own side in check and going in the direction that we would want it to.
The authors found support for what you just said, that receiving information that the other side is more loyal to democracy than you thought is going to make you more willing to democracy yourself. So the question is where does this intervention come from in real life? The authors gave it to the respondents as they took the survey, but where are we going to get this information in real life? And you're exactly right that the media is a really big problem when it comes to this. And I don't think that they can be trusted to accurately portray both sides as loyal to democracy like the data shows. And so, like you said, that in our own political decisions and conversations, we need to trust the other side as loyal to democracy. I think it's also on the individual to spread the news that the other side is not as anti-democratic as everybody is trying to make you think.
Yeah, I mean, other than the Civic Signal, there are not a lot of places that really give you the news straight up. Just kidding. Um, I think that what you mentioned there, that there's a lot of personal responsibility comes into this. And I think that in addition to reviewing the organizations that you actually receive most of your media from and making sure that they're not consistently feeding this kind of anti-democratic vision of the other side and vision of the things that we should be doing to combat that, I think that another really important thing is to make sure that you're receiving in your social media feed or in your news feed content from people on the other side, because the best way to see, oh well, what is it that the other side thinks, is to just hear from them what they think. And so, unfollowing people on social media who disagree with you on policy issues, that's a bad place to start, right? We should see the opinions of people who disagree with us, because if you have friends or if you follow reputable news sources on the other side, then what that leads to is seeing, okay, I do have differences with these people, and I do think that some of their ideas might be bad, but they're not the enemies that certain politicians and media figures would like to make me think that they are.
It seems like every time we're looking at this research, the conclusion from our discussion is that the individual needs to take a step up and do what we can to change. I think when you're reading this kind of research and you're talking about it to other people, it's easy to say like, "Wow, those people in that study are really bad." But that's us that this finding is about. And if we're always looking at this from an outside perspective, we're never going to be able to change it. And that's kind of the purpose of this channel and discussions that we're having and sharing with other people is to encourage individuals to apply what we've learned from this scientific research into their political interactions to try to make it all a little bit better. And I think that this is a really, really easy one to start with, is just trying to change your mindset that the other side is not anti-democratic. And what the research shows is that that's going to strengthen your support for democratic principles, and it's also going to make you and people like you less willing to vote for leaders who are less democratic. And then another easy thing you can do is share this video with your friends, because the more people that can learn about this research and can learn about how the effect and interventions can change political behavior, the more likely that this is actually going to have an impact in the political climate.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Civic Signal, where Brandon and I discussed why voters who value democracy participate in democratic backsliding, an important piece of research. Give the video a comment, a like, make sure that you're subscribed, turn on post notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos. And if you've got a topic, whether it's a research topic or just a general topic in political science or politics, let us know and we'll take your opinion into consideration and see if we can make a video that'll entertain and also inform you guys. You just watched The Dark Knight, right?
Yeah.
Tell me if this sounds familiar. Harvey Dent. When their enemies were at the gate, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. It wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service. And then Rachel goes, Harvey, the last man who they appointed to protect the republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power. Boom. Establishing anti democratic leaders to combat anti democratic enemies.
Lessons from Batman.